To us, the image of Jesus as the shepherd is obviously precious and meaningful. If you're like me, you remember lots of Sunday school pictures with the same theme. But Jesus as shepherd would not have been automatically meaningful for much of the ancient world. Greeks and Romans generally looked down on shepherds, thinking of them as dirty and smelly, since they spent so much of their time outdoors with animals. Aristotle called them lazy. Many Romans believed they also practiced highway robbery. So the Greco-Roman world would have struggled with the imagery of Jesus as a shepherd, and it would have seemed to Romans to confirm the bad reputation of Christians. I don't know how much it figured in the early church, this image, but the Christians clearly did not abandon the idea of the shepherd in order to gain a better public relations image. Eventually, the thought of God as my shepherd and of Jesus as the good shepherd was reinvented in the minds of the Greco-Roman world. But even the Israelites had ambiguous ideas about shepherds. I've read that they tended to think of the average shepherd as up to no good, possibly engaging in highly inappropriate activities. Yet they also had scriptural images of God and King David as loving, responsible shepherds. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. Importantly, Jesus himself seemed to have no problem with calling himself a shepherd. He lived in an agrarian community growing up. This means he would have known shepherds, so he was familiar with them as responsible individuals who cared for their animals. Oh, it's possible he'd known a few who weren't so great. No group is entirely wonderful. In the same way, he must have seen parents who were careless, rigid, or unkind to their children. And yet his overall image of parenting is so positive that he taught us to call God Father or Daddy. And he told stories about a father, for example, who flouted expectations and loved his children beyond measure, even when they rejected his way of doing things. In the same manner, Jesus was comfortable depicting shepherds in this positive way. He even told a story about a shepherd who had a flock of 100 sheep. One was careless or willful enough to wander away from the rest. This shepherd didn't shrug his shoulders and say, well, that stupid animal deserves what it gets, and I want to relax. No, the shepherd put the 99 other sheep into the fold where they'd be safe, and then hunted until he found the one that was lost and brought it home to safety. Although attributed to King David, the 23rd Psalm was probably not written by him. The reference to the house of the Lord indicates this. Remember, it was David's son, Solomon, who built the temple. William Taylor also points out that the individualism reflected in the poem suggests a date in the post-exilic period. That's when the relationship of God and the individual began to gain more significance. Prior to that time, the emphasis had been upon God and the nation. Still, it must have seemed appropriate to have given David credit for this psalm about the Good Shepherd. David was first a boy working on his father's land. He had been a shepherd, and he knew the shepherd's importance to the survival of the flocks. Likely, he'd struggled with wayward sheep who ran in opposite directions than they were supposed to. With his skill in the slingshot, he must have saved many of his flock from the jaws of wild animals. And David had a lot of faults, and he did some pretty deplorable things. But he mostly remained faithful to his God in some fashion. And that, of course, is the difference between us as the sheep of God's pasture and the kind that runs around on four legs. When humans are shepherds of a flock, the sheep don't have a say in the matter. The animals are raised for the convenience of humans, and while a shepherd might love his flocks and risk great danger for them, one who benefits in the end is the shepherd, and those who use the wool, milk, or mutton. As humans, we are allowed to claim our shepherd. God does not force our allegiance. We say, God, the Lord is my shepherd, as an act of faith and loyalty, rather than as mere acceptance of established fact. Part of the history of the Bible is the history of people who sought other pastures and other kinds of shepherds, or who simply wandered aimlessly in a spiritual wilderness. Of course, in another sense, there is no choice we can make. God may allow us to wander from the fold, but the truth is we never cease being part of God's flock. God never stops being the shepherd who seeks us lovingly to bring us home in safety. In today's world, animals are often branded or otherwise marked to show who owns them. Now, we don't get that kind of mark. We can wear a cross or a Christian symbol, but if our actions or our words are not in accord with that symbol, people will either conclude we are hypocritical wolves in sheep's clothing, or that the flock and the shepherd are not worth their time. It is therefore tempting to interpret the psalm to mean, the Lord is my shepherd, and if I claim God as my shepherd, I shall not be found wanting in love, justice, humility, or other Christ-like graces, for I am called to follow the shepherd in all the paths of righteousness in which he shall lead me. But while that is true, I don't think it's what the psalmist was intending to say in this point. The author was likely thinking of the shepherd's role in leading the flocks to pastures where there would be ample food and to water or to shelter when the weather was fierce. Now, many people, since long before the author's time, have believed that following God means that everything in life will be taken care of, that it will be like a green pasture or still waters, etc. I once had a friend who had broken her neck in an automobile accident several years before that. She wasn't paralyzed, but she spent a long time in the hospital and always afterwards suffered some discomfort from it. Her car had been struck by a driver for a particular religious group. He had been drinking and drove through a red light to strike her. The man was uninjured because he was drunk and was in a huge vehicle versus a passenger car, of course. A woman from his church group visited my friend in the hospital and told her that the man's safety was an example of how the Lord takes care of his own. And by the way, my friend had been a devout Christian since long before the accident, and she knew that God isn't a lucky rabbit's foot. I shall not want is not a promise of an easy life or a protection from the follies of ourselves or of others. Nonetheless, when we give the shepherd the opportunity, our souls can be restored and refreshed for the task and journey. But the green pastures and the still waters are not a home in which we take up permanent residence. In this life, at least, they are the way stations where we gain strength and vitality for the responsibilities ahead. The poem also says, after all, he shall lead me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. The psalmist recognized that there are realities and there are responsibilities even within the fold of God. Valleys with dark shadows will still need to be traversed. Tasks will still have to be accomplished. The path of righteousness has to be followed, but hopefully with joy. A devotional writer of long ago called Patience Strong wrote that it is not a smoother path we need, but good strong shoes we lack. We are not hirelings of God, nor sheep protected and guided only for God's convenience. God invites us as guests and as co-workers in the building of the kingdom. And sometimes in the following of the path of righteousness, we will need those strong shoes and the knowledge that the shepherd walks with us every step of the way. And surely goodness and mercy shall follow us all the days of our lives, and we shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Amen.